By the end of this day, the world would witness the worst nuclear disaster in human history. Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant would explode, releasing radiation across Europe and changing the course of nuclear energy forever. But 24 hours earlier, none of this was inevitable. April 25, 1986 began as an ordinary day. The Soviet Union was at the height of its power. Chernobyl, located in northern Ukraine, was one of the largest and most advanced nuclear facilities in the world. 4 RBMK-1000 reactors were operational. A fifth was under construction. The plant provided electricity to millions. It was a symbol of Soviet technological achievement. Reactor 4 had been running smoothly since 1983. On this day, a routine safety test was scheduled. The test was designed to determine whether the reactor's turbines could generate enough electricity to power emergency systems during a shutdown. It had been delayed multiple times. Today, it would finally proceed. The test was not considered dangerous. It had been approved by plant management. Senior engineers would oversee the procedure. Standard protocol would be followed, or so it was believed. At this point, the staff working at Chernobyl had no reason to suspect anything would go wrong. The reactor had built-in safety mechanisms. The operators were experienced. The Soviet nuclear program had an established reputation. But what the operators did not fully understand was the reactor's design flaws. The RBMK-1000 had a critical vulnerability. Under certain conditions, it could become unstable. This information was not widely known, even among the engineers who worked there. The test itself would require temporarily reducing the reactor's power. Several automatic safety systems would need to be disabled. This was part of the procedure. On paper, it seemed manageable. In reality, it would create a sequence of events that could not be reversed. By the time the sun set on April 25th, decisions had already been made. Shifts had been assigned. The test parameters had been set. The countdown had begun. In less than 24 hours, Reactor 4 would cease to exist, and the name Chernobyl would be remembered forever. At 6:00 a.m. on April 25, 1986, the morning shift arrived at Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. The facility operated around the clock. 3 shifts rotated every 8 hours. The day shift took control of Reactor 4's main control room. Leonid Toptanov, 26 years old, was the senior reactor control engineer. He had worked at Chernobyl for less than a year. Alexander Akimov, 33, was the shift supervisor. Both men were well-trained. Both followed procedure. The reactor was operating at full capacity, 3,200 megawatts of thermal power. Everything appeared normal. Cooling water circulated through 1661 pressure tubes. Steam drove the turbines. Electricity flowed into the grid. The control room was filled with analog instruments, hundreds of dials, switches, and indicators. It was a complex system, but the operators knew it well. The safety test was scheduled to begin that afternoon. The goal was simple. During a reactor shutdown, the turbines would continue spinning for a short time due to inertia. The test would determine if that residual energy could power emergency cooling pumps until backup generators activated. It was a valid question, one that had been raised before. The test had been postponed several times due to scheduling conflicts. Today it would finally happen. The procedure required gradually reducing the reactor's power output from 3,200 megawatts to between 700 and 1,000 megawatts. This would simulate a controlled shutdown. Once stable at that level, the test would begin. At around 1 p.m., the power reduction started. Operators began withdrawing control rods from the reactor core. These rods absorbed neutrons and regulated the nuclear reaction. Pulling them out increased power. Inserting them decreased it. The process was routine. The reactor responded as expected. Power levels began to drop steadily. But at 2 p.m. something unexpected happened. The Kiev electrical grid controller requested that Chernobyl maintain full power output for several more hours. The city needed electricity. The test would have to wait. Reactor 4 was held at 1,600 megawatts. Half power. The operators paused the procedure. This was not part of the original plan. The delay introduced a variable no one had fully considered. The reactor remained in a transitional state for hours, a state it was not designed to maintain for long periods. At 11:00 p.m. on April 25th, the night shift arrived at Reactor 4. Alexander Akimov and Leonid Toptunov remained on duty. They would oversee the test. The evening shift supervisor, Yuri Tregub, handed over control. He briefed Akimov on the day's events. The test had been delayed. The reactor was still at reduced power. Akimov acknowledged the situation. At 11:10 p.m., authorization came through. The test could proceed. The operators resumed the power reduction. The target was 700 to 1,000 megawatts thermal. At that level, the reactor would be stable enough for the experiment. Toptunov began inserting control rods. The power decreased gradually. But at 12:28 a.m. on April 26th, something went wrong. The power dropped suddenly. It fell to just 30 megawatts, far below the target range. The reactor was now barely producing energy. This was a dangerous condition. At such low power, the reactor became difficult to control. A buildup of xenon-135, a neutron-absorbing byproduct, began poisoning the reaction. The reactor was slipping into instability. Toptunov tried to recover. He withdrew more control rods. He needed to raise the power back to safe levels, but the reactor responded sluggishly. By 1 a.m., the power had climbed back to only 200 megawatts, still far too low. At this point, the test should have been postponed. Protocol required a minimum power level of 700 megawatts. Operating below that range violated safety guidelines. But the decision was made to continue. The test had already been delayed multiple times. Management wanted it completed. Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov was present. He had authority over the operation. Dyatlov ordered the operators to proceed. He believed the reactor could be stabilized. To compensate for the low power, Toptunov withdrew nearly all the control rods. Only a handful remained inserted. This left the reactor with almost no safety margin. If anything went wrong, there would be no way to shut it down quickly. The operators knew this was risky, but they followed orders. At 1:05 a.m., the cooling pumps were increased to maximum flow. Water rushed through the reactor core. This was necessary for the test, but it also increased pressure and reduced steam production. The reactor was now operating outside its design parameters. At 1:07 a.m., several automatic safety systems began signaling warnings. The reactor's emergency core cooling system detected abnormal conditions. Under normal circumstances, this system would automatically shut down the reactor, but the test required it to be disabled. The operators had turned it off. This was part of the approved procedure. Without it, there was no automatic protection. At 1:15 a.m., additional alarms activated. Computer printouts showed that the operational reactivity margin had fallen to dangerous levels. The ORM measured how many control rods remained available to regulate the reaction. Regulations required a minimum of 15 rods. Reactor 4 now had only 6 to 8. This violated a critical safety rule. Leonid Toptunov reported the readings to Alexander Akimov. Both men understood what it meant. The reactor was on the edge of instability. Akimov hesitated. He considered aborting the test. But Anatoly Dyatlov intervened. He insisted the test continue. Dyatlov had spent years in the Soviet nuclear program. He believed the operators were being overly cautious. He dismissed their concerns. The decision was final. The test would proceed. At 1:19 a.m., the operators began closing the turbine steam valves. This simulated the shutdown scenario they were testing. Steam flow to the turbines stopped. The turbines began to coast on inertia. Their rotation slowed. This was the critical moment. The question was whether the turbines could generate enough power for the emergency pumps. But closing the steam valves had an unintended effect. With less steam leaving the reactor, pressure increased inside the core. Water temperature began to rise. More steam formed in the cooling channels. The reactor's power output started climbing, slowly at first, then faster. At 1:22 a.m., Toptonov noticed the power surge. He tried to stabilize it. He adjusted coolant flow. He attempted to insert control rods, but the reactor was no longer responding predictably. The power continued rising. Within seconds, it doubled, then doubled again. The operators in the control room exchanged glances. Something was very wrong. At 1:23 a.m., Akimov gave the emergency order. He told Toptonov to press AZ-5, the emergency shutdown button. It would insert all remaining control rods simultaneously. Toptonov pressed it. The rods began descending into the reactor core, but they moved slowly. Too slowly. At 1:23:40 a.m., the control rods jammed. They stopped descending, only partway into the reactor core. The RBMK-1000 design had a fatal flaw. The tips of the control rods were made of graphite. Graphite accelerates the nuclear reaction. As the rods entered the core, they briefly increased reactivity instead of decreasing it. This was the opposite of what was needed. The power surge accelerated. Within 3 seconds, the reactor's output skyrocketed, from 200 megawatts to over 33,000 megawatts, more than 10 times its maximum capacity. The fuel rods inside the core began to rupture. Uranium pellets shattered. Superheated steam exploded through the pressure tubes. The cooling water flashed instantly into steam. Pressure inside the reactor vessel exceeded all limits. At 1:23:43 a.m., the first explosion occurred, a massive steam blast. The force lifted the 1,000-ton upper biological shield. The reactor lid. It tilted at an angle and crashed back down. The reactor hall filled with steam and smoke. Alarms blared throughout the control room. Every indicator went critical. Lights flickered. The building shook. Akimov and Toptonov stared at the control panels in disbelief. Seconds later, the second explosion followed. This one was larger, a combination of steam and hydrogen ignition, possibly a small nuclear excursion. The explosion tore through the reactor building. The roof disintegrated. Concrete and steel were thrown hundreds of meters into the air. The reactor core was now exposed to the atmosphere. 2,000 tons of graphite moderator began burning, releasing radiation directly into the night sky. Chunks of reactor fuel were ejected across the facility. Some landed on the roof of Reactor 3, starting additional fires. Others fell onto the turbine hall. Blazing graphite ignited tar and bitumen roofing materials. Flames spread rapidly. Inside the control room, the operators could not see what had happened. The reactor hall was filled with smoke and steam, but the instruments told a story. Every reading was either at maximum or completely offline. Radiation detectors saturated immediately. Akimov refused to believe the reactor had been destroyed. It seemed impossible. He ordered his team to begin emergency cooling procedures. Firefighters from the plant's own brigade arrived within minutes. They saw flames shooting from the destroyed building. They did not yet know they were walking into lethal radiation. By 2 a.m., firefighters were battling the blaze on the roof of Reactor 3. They climbed ladders carrying hoses. The flames were intense. Burning graphite produced temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. The firefighters wore standard protective gear, not designed for radiation. They had no idea what they were exposed to. Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik led his team onto the roof. Chunks of reactor core lay scattered around them, glowing with residual heat. Each piece was lethally radioactive. Pravik and his men worked for hours. They prevented the fire from reaching Reactor 3. If that reactor had been compromised, the disaster would have been exponentially worse. By dawn, the fires on the roof were contained, but the graphite fire inside Reactor 4 continued burning. It would burn for 9 days. Meanwhile, inside the control room, confusion remained. Akimov insisted the reactor core was intact. He believed cooling water could still be pumped in. He sent 2 operators to manually open feed valves in the reactor hall. Both men were exposed to extreme radiation. They completed their task, but the water never reached the core. There was no core left to cool. By 5 a.m. on April 26th, the Soviet government was informed. Initial reports downplayed the severity. Officials in Moscow did not immediately grasp what had happened. Radiation readings were dismissed as instrument errors. The city of Pripyat, 3 kilometers away, was not evacuated. Residents woke up that morning unaware. Children went to school. People continued their daily routines. Radioactive dust settled over the city throughout the day. It was not until 36 hours later that evacuation orders were issued. By then, significant exposure had already occurred. In the weeks that followed, over 600,000 liquidators were deployed. They worked to contain the disaster. Many received fatal doses of radiation. A concrete sarcophagus was eventually built over Reactor 4. The exclusion zone remains uninhabitable today. 31 people died in the immediate aftermath. Thousands more would die from radiation-related illnesses in the years to come. Chernobyl changed everything. Nuclear safety protocols were rewritten worldwide. Public trust in nuclear energy was shattered. The Soviet Union's credibility collapsed. This was day falling. One day, everything changes.